continuing with chapter 2, since it got so hot outside that my phone shut down, we're going to pick up with verse 14. In chapter 2, verse 14, we read, "At mealtime, Boaz said to Ruth, 'Come on over.'" Come on over. The word here means to come and to approach. It also means to have potential sexual intercourse. So romance is really starting to blossom now between Ruth, who is the apple of Boaz's eyes, and Boaz, whom Ruth now calls my master, my lord. So Boaz says, "Come on over here. Have some bread and dip it into some wine vinegar," which again is a source of nourishment for the body, especially on the hot days of working out in the harvest fields. So when Ruth approaches, she sits down next to Boaz and the harvesters. The word to sit down also has an implication of getting married. So there's a romance to the word that is used to describe what Ruth does. She sits down, and we read that Boaz offers her some roasted grain, and she ate all that she wanted, which means she satisfied herself. So Ruth is satisfied by sitting romantically and eating next to Boaz. Now notice, Ruth is no longer with the servant girls. Once again, she's elevated in social status. She is now with the harvesters. So, she is working her way up the social ladder as her relationship with Boaz continues to grow. Ruth then got up to go back and glean, and Boaz gave orders to his men. And he said, "Even if she gathers among the sheaves, don't embarrass her." Again, it means don't mistreat her. Don't cause her to feel shame. So then he says, don't embarrass her. Rather, pull up some stalks from her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up. And don't rebuke her. Boaz not only upholds the law of Moses, which says to leave some grain behind for the poor and the widows, now he says, pull out some of the best stalks of grain and drop them for her to pick up. So Boaz exceeds the law of God. He shows so much more grace to Ruth. And so Ruth then, it says in verse 17, Ruth went and gleaned in the field until evening. So again, she worked hard. And then, on top of all of the work she put in, she stayed behind and she gathered everything and threshed it. She threshed the grain, the barley, that's removing the grain from the rest of the chaff, and her amount was an ephod. Now, an ephod, in simple terms, is a lot of grain. So Ruth gathered a whole bunch of grain, a whole lot more than a poor widow would normally receive. So Ruth works hard, and she is rewarded greatly by Boaz. Then we're told Ruth carried back what she had gathered and presented it to her mother-in-law, to Naomi. And Naomi saw how much Ruth had gathered. Ruth brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. Now, her mother-in-law asks her, Where did you get all this that you have gleaned today? So Naomi is revived in her spirit by the presence of food as well, of such favor, such grace bestowed upon Ruth. She says, Blessed is the man who took notice of you. Naomi is surprised to find just how well Ruth did while working in the fields. So Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one whose place she had been working. She says, The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz. Ho ho! Now the light bulbs start to turn on in Naomi's head. Because in verse 20, she proclaims, The Lord, the God of Israel, Yahweh bless him. She said to her daughter-in-law, For he has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. And she says, This man is a close relative. He's not only a champion, he's not only a great man, and a good husband, if you can get him to be your husband. He's a close relative. And so this is the one we've been hoping for he is our kinsman redeemer, the one who can restore us to our community, the one who can restore hope, the one who can provide protection for us, the one who can uphold the law of Moses. Naomi, who was quite bitter in chapter 1, now has newfound hope for family. So then, verse 21 says, Then Ruth the Moabitess said, He even said to me, Stay with my workers until they finished harvesting all my grain. Again, the word stay is the Hebrew word to cling, the same word used to describe Ruth's relationship to Naomi. So now Boaz is applying the same action of clinging to his relationship between himself and Ruth. He says to Ruth, cling. Don't just cling to my servant girls, now cling to my harvesters. Maintain the social status I've elevated you to. Stay permanently in my fields. Naomi then said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it will be good for you, my daughter, to go with his girls. Because in someone else's field you might be harmed. All right, so obviously Naomi sees that spark of romance reflected in Ruth's eyes as Ruth is talking about Boaz. And Naomi's got the wheels turning in her mind. And so it says here that Ruth then stayed, she clung to the servant girls and to the harvesters of Boaz, gleaning until the barley and the wheat harvests were finished. So quite some time passes in verse 23. Time where Boaz can charm the apple of his eye, and time when the apple of his eye can use her feminine wiles to further that romance. All right, and then it says that Naomi lived with her mother-in-law. So in chapter 2, we see in the original story that not only is hope renewed for Ruth and Naomi through Boaz, their kinsman redeemer, but a very passionate romance is developing. Naomi takes notice of this romance. In antiquity, it was the mother's responsibility to help guide her daughter in the matters of relationships and in the matters of sexual experiences. And so as we move into chapter 3, Naomi's going to set a plan in place to ensure that this growing romance between Ruth and Boaz not only continues, but is taken to the next level, a level which will provide not only hope for them, but which will be worked into God's eternal plan for the redemption of the world. We'll see you next time for chapter 3. Amen.